Good morning, math lovers of the world, which is the entire world, because math rules. Everything else is just uncivilized. But nonetheless, I want to start off with yesterday's topic test. I think as a whole, we did really well, so I'm very proud that we did so well. A lot of A's I saw out there. Um, Also, just so you know, uh, you'll realize that a lot of people, let's say you got 12, you actually on your grade link, it'll say 12.5 or 12 and a half. I gave that extra half because the only other way you would have been able to get an A mathematically according to the scale would have been if you got perfect. And I don't believe that's right because I think that if you are literally only made one mistake or only had one wrong, then that is definitely an A, right? Because that means you pretty much did everything right except for maybe one question. And so if you got a 12.5, you got the A, right? Because 12 should have been an A because 92%, and that's the highest you get without going perfect. And so that's why I gave the extra 0.5 because 93 is technically the A, and since it was only 92, I didn't think that was fair. So I added a half point to everybody's score. That includes, even if you didn't get an A, everyone got an extra half point, right? So just because there's less questions, and with less questions, it's harder to make sure it's perfect. So that's why the extra 0.5 is there. Like I said, good job on the most part. If I'm going to point out a specific issue, that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Because I noticed this was an issue with a lot of people, and it's sort of when they're asking about the cubic units, and we're starting to see flying or floating cubes, and that wouldn't be correct. So I'm gonna show you what I'm talking about. So if I'm looking at this, for example, right, I can very much tell that this is one cube here, and then this is another cube here, and this is another cube here, and this is another cube there, right? I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So right now I see 4 cubic units. Right? So far so good. Easy peasy. I can tell us one, I can tell us another, another. However, right, is there any cubes that are being blocked or that you can't see? Well, there would have to be, right? Because this block right here, if it has no block to sit on, it's just floating, and that wouldn't make any sense, which means that underneath it, there must be another cube, right, which is how it's stacked, right? That's how it stands up, and that's how come you can tell that it's up there. And so it's not 4 cubes, it would actually be 5 cubic units, because otherwise it would be floating in thin air. And we don't have any magic cubes like that, so unfortunately it doesn't work that way, right? It would actually be 5 because 1, 2, 3, the next one that's in between them, and then this one, which would make it 5, right? Because it has to sit on something, it can't be floating in thin air. In fact, I could just show you sort of how it would look like without the one on top, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, but notice they're being blocked, and then add the other one. And that's how you get the 5th, right? Because it's sitting on that other block, or that other cube, should I say. And so that's why it's 5 cubic units. In this case, I'm not sure what the other, not on the top of my head, I can't tell you what the cubes were in the test, but it can't float, right? So no floating cubes, or it needs something to sit on, so obviously that would have been 5, if that was the question. With that said, we're talking now about, we went from units of volume, right? How much is inside of something in a 3-dimensional figure, as opposed to area, because we've done area, we've done perimeter, we've done volume, and now we're actually going to look at measurement and converting measurement when we're talking about length, right? Now, in this case, right, we see lovely little measuring sticks, different types of measuring sticks. In fact, you could even have a yardstick, which I don't have. No, I do not have a yardstick, but a yardstick obviously would be measured by yards, right? And so right, as we're talking about topic 13 now, we're looking at different measurements, right? How much they equal, and if we can change one to the other. And of course we can't. Now these are gonna be the easier ones technically because these are within the same system, right? Now, the United States happens to be one of the few systems in the world that does not use the metric system. And so it is interesting just to see if you go to a different country, especially a European country, which is most of the world pretty much, does use the metric system. Metric system means that you're using meters instead of yards and feet and inches. So in the metric system, it's meters, centimeters, millimeters, decimeters. That's how the metric system works. But as Americans in the United States, we use the non-metric system, which I've already forgot what it's called. Shame on me. But point is, this is what we're doing. So one, I want you to write these down in your notebook because you're gonna need these for life, right? These you're gonna see all the time. And if you don't have the basics, then everything else will crumble. So let's make sure we get the basics. So we start off with an inch, right? We know inches. And then we see a foot, right? 1 foot equals 12 inches. What that means, right, is pretty obvious, right? If you have a ruler, right, and this ruler, you see how much inches are, and you know that you're gonna have 12 inches to equal to 1 foot. Which means an inch is smaller than a foot, obviously, because you need 12 of them to get 1 foot. And then we have the yard. Now for a yard, you're gonna need 3 feet, which means this is gonna be a whole lot bigger, right? We're looking at from there to there, right? That's what it looks like. So a yard is bigger than a foot, and how many do we need? We need 3 feet to equal 1 yard. Now then we get to the mile, right? Now 1 mile is bigger than a yard, and a mile equals 1,760 yards, which is also the same as 5,280 feet. So like I said, I want you to write these down because these are going to be your basic facts that a lot of us already know most of them, right? We should already know that 1 foot equals 12 inches. And so let's just make sure we know all of these because when we go from the basics, then we can start working on the harder stuff. All right, so let's write that down. You've written it down because you can pause, right? Magic of YouTube, you can pause and then just write it down. You don't need me to go around and wait for you. So here's the thing. Now we're trying to figure out for this topic, how do we change it from one type of unit of measurement to another? So for example, if I want to know how much 6 feet is in inches, then what do? That's a toughie, right? I know that 1 foot equals 12 inches. So if I want to find out 6 feet, what would I do? Well, I know 1 foot is 12 inches, so I know if I had 2 feet, it would be 12 plus 12, right, which would be 24. If I know if it were 3 feet, I would do 12 plus 12 plus 12, right, and that would give me 36 inches. So I'm seeing this pattern already, and I'm like, oh, well, it seems like with feet to inches, I would just multiply by 12, right? Because I know 1 foot equals 12 inches. I could even show you just in case you're wondering. So if 1 foot equals 12 inches, then 2 feet would equal 12 plus 12, right? 3 feet would equal 12 plus 12 plus 12, which equals 36, by the way, 24. And I start realizing, oh, actually what I'm doing here is I'm just multiplying by 12. 3 feet times 12 equals 36, 2 times 12, 24, 1 times 12 is 12. I'm like, oh, that's easy. Then in this case, for me to figure out how much 6 feet would be, I would say, well, I would multiply 6 times 12. Makes sense, right? And 6 times 12, 72, which means 6 feet equals 72 inches. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. However, if I'm going from 6 feet to yards, it changes up a little bit, right? Because what's bigger, a foot or a yard? The yard is bigger, right? 1 yard equals 3 feet. And so now it's a little bit different because if I try to do the same thing I did with the inches, and if I try to multiply, I would say 6 times 3, which is 18. Would 6 feet equal 18 yards? That doesn't make sense, right? Because a yard is bigger than a foot. So what would I do instead? Well, I might think about my inversions and start thinking, well, that works works if a foot is bigger than inches, but since it's not, then maybe instead of multiplying, that's right, I might be dividing instead. So I might say, okay, 6 feet, maybe I'm dividing by how much feet are in a yard. And so there's 3 feet in a yard, so 6 divided by 3 gives me 2. So it would be 2 yards. Now, can I check that? Of course I can, right? Because I can say, well, 2 yards, can I convert 2 yards to feet? Yeah, because 1 yard equals 3 feet, 2 yards equals 6 feet. That makes sense, right? Because I know how to multiply easier than I know how to divide, but it still works. But here's what we're noticing. Here's the pattern we're noticing. That when you're converting a larger unit to a smaller unit, I multiply. And that sounds kind of unusual because normally we think when we're going from small to big, you're obviously multiplying. But in this case, because we're converting, we're changing the units, it's actually the opposite. When you go from a bigger unit to a smaller unit, because feet is bigger than inches, then you're actually going to be multiplying in order to get the conversion. As opposed to this one where if you are converting smaller unit to larger unit, since a foot, right, is smaller than a yard, we divide. In other words, you got to think opposites here, right? If you're going from small to big, you're dividing. If you're going from big to small, you're multiplying. And so be aware of that because it is going to be a little different. And you get used to it, especially if you have this in your face the whole time. You start getting used to how you're multiplying or how you're dividing. Let's try one last one before we head out because we want to make sure we get all of these right. So let's say I want to do 12 yards. Right? And let's say I want to change my yards to feet. Okay, so I'm going from yards to feet. What's bigger, a yard or a foot? A yard's bigger, right? So since I'm going from big to small, I'm actually going to multiply, right? Because normally I think small to big is multiplying. But in this case, since I am doing the opposite and going from big to small, I'm actually multiplying. So I'm going to say, okay, 12, and how much is it? 1 yard. I see 1 yard is 3 feet, so I'll multiply 12 times 3, which gives me 36 feet. Makes sense because, you know, there's a lot of feet in a couple of yards, and so just by multiplying, figured it out. Should be good to go. FYI, folks, if you do get confused and you need some extra different help too, you can always use your math book, people. So if you look in your math book, there's always some sort of reteaching there. So you could always use the reteaching in your math. You could use the reteaching in the worksheets, and that helps us out as well, okay? So otherwise, good luck, good fight, good night, and I will see you tomorrow.